I'm not sure what chapter it is. Okay, I didn't look. The last thing that we're going to be talking about this quarter is we're going to be talking about populations and how populations change, and then how they could potentially give rise to new species. So we're going to kind of put our whole discussion about genetics and genetic variation into the realm of population genetics, okay, which we actually already did a little bit of this week. If you did lab last week and this week, we're looking at the hemoglobin allele and how it can possibly be advantageous in the presence of a disease called malaria. Okay. So in our discussion of Gregor Mendel, when he was doing his work with pea plants, remember I told you that it was prior to actually having any knowledge of what a gene was. And Darwin, Charles Darwin, was actually a contemporary of Gregor Mendel, but they did not have, they weren't aware of one another's research. And so it wasn't until after they both died that people started putting the Mendelian and patterns of inheritance together with what we'll call Darwinian biology, okay? So in order to understand what was happening in the 1850s, remember we were talking about the blending theory, right, in terms of Gregor Mendel. In the 1850s, there was also some theories about species and groups of organisms. And so when we look at pre-Darwinian ideas about biology and life on this planet, the first idea is that species do not change. And this actually had kind of a funny name. It was called species fixity. And this was actually put forward by another scientist in the 1700s called Linnaeus. You might have heard of him. He's the one that came up with the taxonomic hierarchy and how we group species and groups of animals together, and how his idea was that there was the ideal form of a species. So if we looked at Asian elephants, there would be an ideal form of the Asian elephant, and that the species did not change over time. So this idea was that a creator created the species as we see them today. So something created the Asian elephant and the African elephant as we see them today, and they did not evolve from a common ancestor, okay? So that's the idea of species fixity. So the second thing is that the Earth is relatively young. And there was lots of arguments about how young it was, but some people believed it was between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. So it was relatively young, right, in terms of what we now think of as the planet. And some of those estimates were taken from looking at generations in the Bible and going back and figuring out how many generations we would go back to get to Adam and Eve. Okay, the third thing is that variation, like I said before, variation was not important. That there is an ideal form of each species. Right, and it didn't matter, like, in terms of like biblical history, if you just had two animals, like two elephants on Noah's Ark, right, you could then populate the rest of the world with offspring from those two individuals. So we now realize that variation is really important, and so we have a problem because a lot of our species are going down and dwindling in numbers, and we're losing a lot of genetic variation that we really can't get back, the genetic variation that we're losing. So we're going to talk about how variation is important in terms of conservation biology. Like, it's not enough to just to have, 100 individuals of a species. We really need a much larger population in order to maintain the significance variation, okay? So if we look at post-Darwinian views, This is that species do change. And they also share a common ancestor. So if we went back far enough, if I use the elephant example again, the Asian and the African elephants would share a common ancestor, right? Birds and reptiles would share a common ancestor, okay? So all the organisms on the planet share, if you go back far enough, they share a common ancestor. So Darwin called this species transmutation. So instead of species fixity, it was called species transmutation. And he published his work in 1959, or excuse me, 1859, not 19, 1859. And it was called On the Origin of Species. Okay, so that's his famous pivotal work that describes his evidence for why he thinks species do change and how they possibly share a common ancestor. Okay. The second thing about post-Darwinian ideas is Darwin relied a lot upon geology. And so he was looking at the layers of rocks, and he was looking at mountains, and he was seeing that sometimes when you look at rocks on the top of a mountain, you'll actually see seashells there, right? And so the question is how could seashells end up on the top of the mountain? And so when you think about it in geological terms, it's because the seabed rose up and formed a mountain chain, and that is how you could have fossilized seashells on the top of a mountain, right? And so using geology, he drew upon geology to, he didn't know how old it was, but he said the Earth is much older. So the Earth is really old in order for all the geological changes to take place, right? So in order for canyons to be built by rivers that go through rock, right, or wind to blow and make, sandstone stuff, right? So the Earth is really old. And so now we estimate it's about 4 billion years old. Okay, so we say that it's much, scientists say that it's much older than thousands of years, it's billions of years, okay? And then the other thing that he said is that variation is very important. And so he is the person that came up with the idea of natural selection. Now, there was another person that was working on it at the same time, right, whose name was Wallace, right? But he came up with this idea of natural selection. And what this states is that certain individuals, because of their variation, are more likely to survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. Oops, pass on their genes to the next generation. And so he called this the survival of the fittest. So you could say, oops, this would be the survival, but it's also the reproduction. So survival of the fittest. So fitness means that an individual is more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay? And we're going to talk more about some of the assumptions that natural selection has in the model of natural selection a little bit later. But the idea is that there has to be variation so that some individuals are more likely to survive than others. Okay? So variation is important because it allows organisms to change in response to their environment. Okay, so if we look at the lines of evidence that Darwin had to support his ideas about species change, one of the biggest was that we have a fossil record. And so when we look at specifically sedimentary rock, the deposits of sediments over time, what we find is that we have these layers of rocks upon one another, right? And so in this layer, this would be the oldest layer, right? And then at the top, so this is the, so this would be the air, right? So this is the top. So this would be the youngest, right? And so by looking at where fossils are placed in these layers, we can estimate when they were around. And you can do carbon dating. We talked about the carbon 14, which is an isotope of carbon 12, which degrades at a certain pace. But also just looking at, he couldn't do that obviously because he didn't have the technology, but just looking at where fossils are found, right? And so when we look at the fossil record, we could look at dinosaurs, right? So dinosaurs, right, were found here really long time ago in the Jurassic period, right? And then if we we can see that dinosaur fossils are just in a certain period of time, and then they subsequently died, right? But it is believed that those dinosaurs then gave rise to birds. So then if we look at birds, right? We would say that birds evolved from dinosaurs. And actually, they used to be in their whole separate class, but just recently, all the textbooks have been rewritten, and birds are now considered to be reptiles. So they are in the same group with snakes and turtles and lizards, but they're believed to have evolved from a dinosaur ancestor, right? So birds evolved from dinosaurs. So the fossil record tells us that there are organisms that were present on the planet that are no longer present. So one, organisms were on the planet, organisms that were on the planet went extinct and are no longer present. Right. So the dinosaurs, there was a massive extinction event that happened, and the dinosaurs died off relatively quickly. And then what happened is that organisms changed in order to move into those same ecological habitats or the same ecological niches. So if we look at, this would be the dinosaurs, right? Some of them did survive and gave rise to birds, but most of them went extinct. And then we could say that organisms show how they change over time. Right. Organisms show how they change over time in the fossil record. Right. So a really good example of this with the dinosaurs and the birds is a transitional fossil. Called Archaeopteryx. And I say fossil, but there's many, many examples of this fossil. So there's not just one fossil, right? There's actually Archaeopteryx. There's an O there, Opteryx, okay? So Archaeopteryx is a transitional fossil because it kind of looks like a reptile, but it also looks like a bird. So for example, they have wings, right? But they also have claws. And they have a beak-like structure, but they have teeth, right? So this would be bird characteristics, and this would be reptile characteristics. They also have a tail, but the tail actually has vertebrae in it. So modern day birds, their tails are just made of feathers. They don't have like a tailbone going down into their feathers. But Archaeopteryx actually has a set of vertebrae that go down into the tail. So that is an example of a transitional fossil. Okay. Now, another really interesting example of a transitional fossil is in horses. So when we look at the fossilized history of the horses, one thing that's really interesting about the evolution of horses is that they were around in North America at the same time that we actually had a kind of a savanna in the central United States. So you probably might not know this, but we actually used to have rhinos. We used to have zebras and other organisms that you think of as only being in Africa, but we used to have them in North America as well. So the ancient horses were running around with zebras and rhinos in the center of the United States, right? And we see that because we find that there is rhino fossils in the sediments of the United States. There's also lots of dinosaur fossils, right? So we had dinosaurs way before that, okay? So what happened, interestingly, in North America, about 10,000 years ago, we had another massive extinction, and so the horses died off. So the horses, the zebras, the rhinos, even the mastodons, right? They died off, so they went extinct. Okay. And so it's kind of interesting because the horses that we have today are actually reintroduced. So they were reintroduced and brought back to the United States by Europeans. So our horses that we have today, even the wild ones, were not thought to have been the same ones that were around prior to the Ice Age that caused this extinction in North America. But one of the really interesting things about horses is horses used to be smaller. So in the record, the fossil record, the ancestor, so the ancestral horse was smaller. It was spotted, and it was thought to be forest dwelling. Whenever you see spotted, that suggests that an organism lives in the forest because of the light and the shade. You know, the light coming through the trees makes it spotted. And so them being spotted would make them less likely to be seen, okay? So they have those characteristics, but they also have 3 toes. So if you think about horses just have 1 toe. So modern day horses are larger. They don't tend to be spotted in the same way that the ancestral horses. They tend to be living out in open places, the wild horses, and they have only 1 toe, okay? So there's a really interesting place in North America, in Nebraska. And I've been to some of these fossil places. There's lots of really cool ones in North America. But in Nebraska, they have a place called Ashfall. And Ashfall was a place where there was this huge volcanic eruption in Idaho that sent this huge cloud of ash over the middle of the United States. And in this particular fossil site, it killed all the animals while they were at a watering hole, right? And so when they dig down through the ash, they see all these fossilized animals that were present there at that given period of time. Okay. And so I'm going to show you a little video that talks about this site, and then it actually shows you some of the fossilized horses that they found. They also found lots of other interesting organisms, but this one emphasizes the fossilized horses.
First appeared in North America, long before it arose in Africa. In both environments, grass became their staple food, giving rise to similar animals specifically designed to eat.
So this would have been North America, more than 10,000 years ago.
It's one of those grass-eating animals that evolved in North America first. Another is the ancestor of the modern horse. When we learned about history in school, we were taught that the Spanish brought the first horses into America. But I think that's where paleontology fill in the gaps in the record. It's certainly true, the Spaniards did bring horses into America, but 50 million years before that, we certainly had horses here in America. And right there in Nebraska, there's 50 million year record of horse evolution. So in some ways, this is the sort of the proving ground or the evolutionary call in which the grass-eating species go on. There are few opportunities in paleontology to examine a species as it evolved at a specific moment in time. But in 1979, Mike's crew uncovered a unique treasure at Ashfall. 70 skeletons from 5 different species of horse. The find itself was a rarity, but even more unusual was the discovery that some horses had 3 toes, while others in the same species had only 1. There are some horses here that, at least in terms of the anatomy of their feet, were indistinguishable from modern horses. But the very interesting ones are the ones that are sort of passing through a phase. There should be some evidence of a transition from the triad or the 3-toed stand to the modern 1-toed stand. And up until now, that's never been available to the technology. There's the side. See? Oh yeah, this one has a well-developed side toe. So this one is not the ancestor of the modern horse. By this time, the ancestors of the modern horse had already either lost those side toes or they were extremely small. Yeah, I think anybody that doesn't believe in evolution ought to have a chance to get their nose down close to something like this. 100 years ago, when 3-toed horses were first discovered in the Niobrara Valley, some of the first and some of the best evidence that paleontologists were able to come up with, testing Darwin's theory. We tend to think we know what horses are. 10 million years ago, you had to have, well, which horse are you talking about? You had horses living in Nebraska at this time, ranging in size from the collie dogs up to the size of a Shetland pony. Some had short, stubby legs and lived in forests. Some of them were built like gazelles and lived down in the open plains. Prehistoric horses thrived in North America until 10,000 years ago. In the last ice age, human hunters led to their extinction. But a crucial part of their evolutionary past still survives at Ashfall.
Okay. Okay, so that would be the study of fossils is called paleontology. Okay, so that would be one of the lines of evidence that Darwin used. He saw different fossils than horses. His trip took him to South America. And so one of the things that he was able to see is that we had giant armadillos. So in South Africa, there were, in the fossil record, they were digging them up, these giant skeletons of armadillos. And so this would be like the modern day armadillo. And so in the past, pre-Darwin, we would say that each of these were created separately, right? Darwin said, well, it looks to me like since this one was present a long time ago in the fossil record, and we only have this one present now, that perhaps this is the ancestor to this species. Okay? So it was a whole different way of looking at some of the evolution. We also had giant sloths. And so this is an example of one, right? And so this is a huge giant sloth that was, well, not huge, I think maybe it's like 12 tall. But this is a giant sloth. We don't have giant sloths anymore. You know, they're like this big today. Okay. Okay. So another line of evidence that Darwin used to a great extent in his Origin of Species, so this would be my second line of evidence. This is biogeography. So when you look at this word, that means bio means life, and geography means like where you're distributed, right? So the geography would be like different mountains versus deserts, for example. And so this is the distribution of animals or species in different areas. So we'll just put areas, geographical areas. Okay. And so you probably realize, or you might know, that he was really interested in island biogeography. And what islands was he studying? The Galapagos Islands. And these are, I can never remember how to spell this. I think that's right, Galapagos, yeah, islands. So these are islands off of Ecuador, and they are volcanic in origin. So they're like Hawaii. So they're relatively young compared to the mainland continents. And so when he looked at the distribution of different species, one of the things that he emphasized was the tortoises. So if we look at these two different tortoises, these occur in different islands and in different habitats. So if we look at this tortoise, it has a dome-shaped shell, which means that if it were to raise its head up, his head would hit his shell, and he wouldn't be able to stand up and feed upon vegetation that was very high. Okay, if you compared it to this tortoise, this has a very low-shaped shell, right? It's not domed, it's more flat. And the head and the neck can come up. And so these are the tortoises that feed on shrubs. So these are tortoises that can feed on plants close to the ground. These are tortoises that can feed on shrubs. So his, what he was dealing with is, oh, well, these were created separately. These were different organisms on the Galapagos Islands, and they were created, and they were not related in any way, right? So he said, well, to me, it looks like probably what happened is the tortoises somehow got onto the Galapagos Islands, and where they ended up caused them to change. So they became isolated on islands, and then they evolved particular characteristics that aided them in their ability to survive. Right? So the tortoises, we have dome-shaped shells versus flat shells. Okay? These share a common ancestor. So there was a common ancestor that gave rise to each group, right? And through natural selection, they evolved specific adaptations to their environment, right? So they have different adaptations. So I'll write that here, I'm running out of room. Different adaptations. Okay. Okay, so the other example besides the tortoises on the Galapagos Islands were the finches. So these are the Galapagos finches, right? And in terms of their anatomy, he focused on the beak, right? So beaks are specific to the type of food they eat. Right? So if it is a thick, broad-shaped, we have seed, right? So we have seed eating, right? Versus insects. So if you're a finch that's going to eat seeds, you need to have a bill that's big, thick, and strong so you can crack open the seeds. And if you're just feeding them on insects, you don't need a bill. So his idea again was that there was a common ancestral finch that then moved into different habitats and they changed based upon the adaptation that they needed, right? So we get adaptations to their lifestyle and what they eat, okay? Okay. Now, the biggest, coolest example of island biogeography is the mammals. So this is still biogeography. This is mammals in North America versus Australia. So Australia is a continent that instead of placental mammals, mammals that have a placenta and give birth to well-developed young, these, in Australia, they have marsupials. And marsupials give birth to very underdeveloped offspring, and then the offspring attach onto a nipple, sometimes in a pouch, and then they develop more fully outside of the female's reproductive tract, right? So what we see in North America and Australia is we see placental mammals versus marsupials. And the cool thing is that they both evolved independently of one another because there was no way for there to be real movement between North America and Australia. Because Australia is, via plate tectonics, Australia just kind of floated way away from all the other continents, right? So when we look at some organisms, say for example, we have a kangaroo here shown, that would be a marsupial. And then we also have deer. So deer and kangaroo kind of eat the same kinds of things, right? This is a sugar glider, so we could write sugar glider. And this is the same, very similar, oops, sorry, that's placental, marsupial, sorry. Sugar gliders are placental, right? Sugar gliders versus flying squirrels. And we actually have flying squirrels around here in the pine trees, the ponderosa pine trees, the northern flying squirrel, right? So this is a sugar glider, but if you've ever seen a flying squirrel around here, it looks almost identical to it, right? And so what we see is that different organisms evolve, but they evolve very similar in structure and in adaptations. So we also have marsupial mouse, right? We have a marsupial mouse, and we have a placental mouse, right? We have here, they show the wombat, that's marsupial, but we have a woodchuck. I don't know if we have woodchucks around here. We have marmots, which are kind of like woodchucks. Okay, so the woodchuck and the wombat, right? And then we see things like the wolf, right? And there used to be a marsupial wolf in Australia until humans arrived and subsequently caused them to go extinct. Okay. So what we see in Australia is that we have similar organisms evolving, right? So this is an example of convergent evolution. So this is where similar organisms evolve independently of one another. As they become adapted to their environment. And that should read environment. Oh, dang it. Environment. That says environment, okay? Okay. So that is different from the Galapagos tortoises and the Galapagos finches, which have divergent evolution. So this is versus divergent evolution. Right. So divergent evolution says that you have an ancestral species that gives rise to many new species. Right. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of Darwin's ideas about evolution was the idea of artificial selection. So his big organism that he liked to look at was pigeons. So that would be Darwin. So he looked at the evolution of different pigeons. And so this is the idea that man, or humankind, right, can select for particular traits and can cause organisms to change over time. So that's why it's not natural selection. So artificial selection is where man, or we'll put humans select for particular traits. And this is called selective breeding. And they get different breeds of organisms. So the best example we have is in dogs, right? So when you think about the dogs that we have around, they have been selectively bred for their particular traits. So when you think about where their ancestry is, most of the dogs, their ancestor is the wolf. Now there are a few dog breeds that have the wild dogs in Australia. Does anybody know what dog breed? Can't remember. So, dealer? I don't know. There's some dog breeds that are believed to have a little bit of African wild dog in them, but most of the dogs breeds that you think of are derived from the wolf, right? So what they do is you would selectively breed, and so that you can get variation, right? And so that shows that this, even though they're the same species, so it doesn't show the formation of new species, but it shows how by selective breeding, we can increase the variation, right? So all dog species are of the same species so that they can interbreed, but you see dramatically different phenotypic characteristics in them. And so that is what is referred to as artificial selection. So you would say that all dog breeds are derived from a wolf-like ancestor. And I could put also, or, right, the African wild dogs. Gosh, that would be a really good extra credit to do, because I would love to know which ones they think, which breeds of dogs they think might have the African wild dog blood in them versus the wolf. So do some research on that, figure that out. Okay, so those are the lines of evidence. So we talked about fossil record, we talked about biogeography, we talked about artificial selection. Okay, so on Wednesday we're going to start talking about examples of natural selection, and then we're going to start talking about speciation. So I'm going to stop there for today.